Okay, so in this lecture I'm going to talk about audiolingual method as it's known in the United States and a similar type approach in Britain, and its sphere of influence is situational oral. I'm going to start by talking about the shift, the paradigm shift away from methods like grammar translation to ALM and situational oral are more direct methods. And then I'm going to present to you an ALM lesson, ALM situational oral lesson. And again, the idea of the lesson is not as some historic artifice, but to actually give you a lesson which is very much something that you could actually do, and to show you that elements and features of these particular different methods are still viable today. They still offer you an option. They should be part of your repertoire for you to draw upon depending on the context, the situation, and the needs of the students. Okay, so let's talk about the paradigm shift. And it's a movement from what dominated the teaching of foreign languages for many, many years. Grammar translation is not really a method. It's really a set of conventions in many ways. And that moved towards more direct methods, audiolingual method, and situational oral. So let's look at some of the changes then. So the primacy of literature, that being the goal of language learning, moved to the primacy of the spoken word. So reading as a skill is very much replaced by the skill, the primary skill of speaking. And instead of using L1 as a medium of instruction, it becomes exclusively L2, which becomes the language of instruction. We talk about the history of language teaching methodologies as being one of pendulum swings, and unfortunately what tends to happen when one particular paradigm moves out, it's completely replaced. So the L1 was banished from the classroom and only the L2 could be used in these kinds of approaches. And of course we go from the orthographic, depending on the visual of the word, written word, to the acoustic. And in many strict ALM situational classrooms, students were not actually allowed to write anything down until later on in the class. There's also a movement from deductive teaching of grammar to an inductive teaching of grammar. That is, the examples are provided and students invited to draw their own conclusions about the particular rules that explain their use. And only later is the particular rule made explicit, if at all. The learning theory of grammar translation would probably be said to be rote memorization, and that's replaced by the notion of behaviorism, which looks at language learning in terms of stimulus, response, and reinforcement. And that very much is the model that was translated into what was called then the language laboratory, where drills were provided for students to work by themselves, very much on the basis of giving a stimulus, getting a response, and then reinforcing that. Another kind of way of looking at the movement from grammar translation is to think of it in terms of pre-scientific to the scientific basis for language teaching. And so we get a lot of things happening in linguistics, for example, the development of phonetics and phonology, the work of Henry Sweet, the model for Henry Higgins in Pygmalion. We get a lot of linguists, language teachers, people like Palmer, West, and Hornby, Wes was especially responsible for his work on vocabulary and vocabulary frequency. Firth and Halliday, more in the field of linguistics, were a foundation for what developed in terms of the situational oral. And in terms of linguistic theory as a whole, it's very much based upon structuralism and the notion of contrastive analysis. A final point here in terms of this paradigm shift is to see it in terms of a movement away from, let's call it an ideological imposition. The model for teaching foreign language was always based upon the teaching of Latin. So, and the explanations of grammar were also based upon explanations of Latin grammar. So that was very much a kind of a convention, an ideology, a set of behaviors which was repeated ad nauseam without any real basis for why that particular method was being used. Now we have a response to particular needs, and we can look at some of those needs historically, the development of travel, and with that, the rise of schools like Berlitz, rising immigration, the need for specialized linguists in a war situation. So the Army Specialized Training Program was dedicated to producing linguists in the field who could actually speak and not only were able to read the literature of the country we were fighting against. Think of commerce and globalization. And the need for the spoken language, and also international education. So you get the first school dedicated to teaching international students in an intensive English situation, and that was University of Michigan, the English Language Institute. Okay, so that's the kind of paradigm shift. Some of the issues that we have to take into consideration when we talk about moving from grammar translation to these spoken methods, direct method, ALM, and situational oral. Okay, so let's go to a lesson then. And the lesson will also illustrate some of the elements that go into to lesson planning. So on this particular page, you'll see some of the headings you should be included in a lesson plan. So class. This particular lesson was actually done as a demo lesson for a group of master students. So that's what you're getting there in the description of the particular students. Class or context requires you to describe who the students are and what level of proficiency are they at. We've got aims, and notice the aims can be very, very long, and they refer to specific parts of the language system. So this one has a functional aim, a structural one referring to grammar, phonological, and then we have some secondary aims, and then finally we have some more functional language in terms of speech acts, in terms of offers and acceptances. We always have a set of assumptions about what students already know or what they don't know, and then are looking ahead to any anticipated problems and how those can be overcome. So that's there's no fixed rules about lesson planning, but that's the kind of information you should be including as a preliminary to the actual procedure of the class. So if we look at procedure then, what's important here is it's a clear description of the particular stages of the class. ALM situational oral tended to follow a model which is still used a lot, although it's one particular model, and there are many other models of structuring your lessons, and that is presentation, practice, and production. So in the presentation stage, the teacher is in control and presents the language. Then we have some control practice of that new language, and then we have production, which tends to be a little freer, where students are given a little bit more creativity with the new language item. So this begins with a drill, and this particular drill is to attempt to teach some pronunciation using the names of Italian cities in Italian as opposed to their anglicization. So this is very much working on cognates and trying to show the difference between the anglicized version of an Italian city name and the actual Italian name. So our Rome becomes Roma, Florence becomes Firenze, Venice becomes Venezia. And so that's starts with some drill activity. And then we go on to what really is going to be a dialogue build. And to set the scene, the teacher draws a picture of a party on the board and draws some people on the board and elicits some names. And perhaps the names are going to be something like Maria and Antonio, for example. Who knows? So here what we have is a dialogue, and the teacher's going to elicit this particular dialogue from the student. So the teacher is very much in control. There's no room for creativity here on the part of the student. The student doesn't see this. The teacher attempts to elicit it, and if he doesn't elicit it, then he will give the particular, or she will give the particular form that they're looking for. And it's built up slowly, and ultimately our students will begin to act this out in pairs. So you can see the stages here. When we go to A, elicit first part of the dialogue, and then we're going to practice in open and closed pairs, bring out the best pair of and act out in the front of class, and then continue eliciting for the other two parts of the dialogue and practice as above. So it's very much teacher controlled, a lot of very concentrated listening on the part of the students, and a lot of repetition. The lesson then would continue with some consolidation in the form of the written form. And it's only now students are allowed to actually write things down and see the written form. So that can be very frustrating for a lot of learners who are dependent on the visual support for the acoustic message. There's a grammar review. Notice this is the languages are presented without any explanation about grammar, and now this is part of the inductive approach. We're going to have a look at that dialogue that the students have just learnt and focus on some grammar items. So students may have been able to infer by themselves the first and second person singular forms in Italian of the verb to be, sono and sei, and they probably may have also realized that it's a pro-drop language in that we can omit the personal pronouns I and you and she and it, etc. They'll probably also have discovered that the question form in Italian is made by intonation, and you don't have to make any of the kinds of transformations of declaratives into interrogatives that you have to do in English. Then we get to some control practice. So further practice, but now in pairs and with the written form to help reinforce. And students will work this along in this particular way. And then we get to what can be called the production stage, where students are allowed to a little bit more freedom. All the students are invited up on their feet. They're probably going to be given role play cards, given particular names of famous Italians, Sofia Loren, Marcello Mastroianni, Federico Fellini, and a name of a city. Okay, and so they're going to introduce themselves at the party. Ciao, sono Federico. Ciao, sono Sofia. Piacere, piacere, etc., etc. And that really classically follows the model of presentation, practice, and production. And these kinds of situations then become the core of this approach. So every lesson will focus on a particular situation, and there'll be a particular dialogue that's going to be elicited that the students need to practice and remember. And then in a classic ALM situation, students in future lessons would then go into the language laboratory and practice drills taken from the dialogue.